on JG9 News, we have a lot of new videos out, including the Saints' bizarre justification for keeping on Dennis Allen as their head coach, the Cowboys deciding to bring back Mike McCarthy for another season, and the news that Reba McEntire is doing the national anthem at the Super Bowl. Make sure to check the link in the description to find out more, and subscribe now to JG9 News. And now, on with our feature presentation.
His approach to the game of football is very much like the approach to the game of life, basically fundamental, not leaving anything to chance, being well prepared, thoroughly disciplined. This is the approach that he gave you in getting ready for a football game.
So much for that, as we're about to find out in the craziest way. The 1958 NFL Championship is widely regarded as one of the greatest games ever played. Heck, nearly 65 years later, the name of that game is, simply put, the greatest game ever played. The game featured the Baltimore Colts and the New York Giants squaring off at Yankee Stadium, where, in an absolute thriller, the Colts won by a final score of 23-17 in what was the first game in NFL history to go into overtime. With over 45 million people across the country watching this one, this game was viewed right up there with Super Bowl III as one of the biggest and most influential and important games in the history of the league, because this game was seen as the turning point for the sport's popularity. This was the game that truly showed how great football was as a television sport, and how this was the perfect sport for the growing medium across the country. This was the game where the NFL's popularity across the country truly began to skyrocket, and where there was no going back. After this game, football would be on a meteoric rise to overtake baseball as the most popular sport in the country, a title which it would have a hold on for over 6 decades, and still has to this day by an overwhelming margin. Now, the Colts made this game by virtue of winning their conference, the Western Conference, with a 9-3 record. But the New York Giants made it by having to play in this game right here that you've been watching this whole time, a playoff game, meaning that this game does not happen if they don't beat the Cleveland Browns in the playoffs. And they don't beat the Browns in the playoffs, thereby changing the course of NFL history, if not for one of the craziest touchdowns of all time, and a touchdown that you would never think that offensive coordinator Vince Lombardi would possibly draw up. This was a play so crazy that, simply put, even the Giants were stunned that it worked. This was a play so crazy that the man who scored it had never run it before. And this was a play so crazy that the last time the Giants ran it before the game in practice, it was a complete disaster. The fact that they even attempted this play is crazy in itself. The fact that it worked? Well, this is the story behind what it has to be, considering the circumstances, the craziest touchdown in the history of the conference championship round, and by default, the craziest moment in Vince Lombardi's coaching career. Before I talk about the actual touchdown in question and why the heck this play was so crazy, we need some context to understand the importance of this game, as well as the two teams competing. It's December 21st, 1958, and we're down at Yankee Stadium for the Eastern Conference playoff for this game right here between the main team in our story, the New York Giants, and the Cleveland Browns. How the league worked in 1958 was that you had to win your conference to make the NFL championship. Second place was not good enough, as it was first or nothing. That's how the Baltimore Colts made the NFL championship. They had a 9-3 record, and that was good enough to win over the 8-4 Chicago Bears and the 8-4 Los Angeles Rams. But if there was a tie for the lead in the conference, there were no tiebreakers. A tiebreaker playoff was played between the two teams in question, with the NFL championship simply being moved back a week as a result. That's how the New York Giants were here hosting the Cleveland Browns in this game right here at Yankee Stadium. The Giants had beaten the Browns twice already during the season, with both of those wins being decided by 4 points or less. Heck, if the Giants didn't win their final game of the season against the Browns by a final score of 13-10, they're not in this spot. The Giants had been in survival mode since the beginning of the season after a 2-2 start, as there was not a single day throughout the season where the Giants were ahead of the Browns or tied with the Browns atop the conference past the first week. After their somewhat slow 2-2 start, the Giants had no room for error whatsoever if they wanted to make it to the playoffs and quite possibly the NFL championship. But they did what they had to do, and just the fact that they were in this spot was a miracle, because out of 12 teams in the league, their offense only ranked 9th in the league in points scored. Their defense, under the guidance of Tom Landry, was sensational, allowing just 15.3 points per game, which was first in the league. But if the Giants were going to win this playoff game against the Browns, they would need some sort of spark offensively, which would likely have to come from some sort of trick play or gadget play. This is what we call foreshadowing. And that takes us to the game in question, the Eastern Conference playoff at Yankee Stadium, with a spot in the NFL Championship on the line against the Baltimore Colts. Once again, much like they had been all season, New York's defense was nothing short of sensational. Cleveland only picked up 7 first downs. Their ground game was stifled unlike anything else we had ever seen before. Remember, this was a Browns team that had Jim Brown, maybe the greatest runner that the sport had ever seen. The reason the Browns were in this spot in the first place was because Brown had 1,527 yards and 17 rushing touchdowns, both of which led the league, and because Brown was the MVP for the second straight season. But on this day, nothing. Brown had 7 carries for 8 yards, averaging about 1 yard per carry, in what was just about the worst performance of his career. Cleveland wrapped up just 86 yards of offense all day, and New York's defensive line recorded 6 sacks on Cleveland's 2 quarterbacks in Jim Nowinski and Milt Plum. The Giants' defense forced 4 turnovers, and when you combine Nowinski and Plum, the 2 men went 10 for 27, completing a mere 37% of their passes with no touchdowns, 3 interceptions, and a combined passer rating of 10.9, which is worse than if he did nothing but spiked the ball into the ground on every single play. New York had been great defensively against the Browns all season. The Browns had a top 3 offense in football, and yet, in the 2 regular season meetings between the teams, the Giants allowed a combined 27 points. But this was an otherworldly performance by Tom Landry's defensive unit. But while the defense did their job, the offense was struggling to do theirs. The Giants put the ball on the ground 6 times, and they turned it over 4 times. They were fortunate it wasn't more. This was a game where one touchdown, just one measly touchdown, would make all the difference. And the Giants got it. Because the only touchdown of the game came right here in the first quarter, when from 18 yards out, the Giants did this, and ended up punching their ticket to their first NFL championship since 1946 as a result.
Now watch. On the Browns 18, Connolly hands to Webster, who hands to Gifford on the reverse. Berry supplies the block. Frank laterals to Connolly. It's touchdown, Giants. At the quarter, New York leads 7-0.
Now, as you might be able to expect, this is the only angle available of this play, so you'll be seeing this one a lot over the next few minutes while I talk about this. But this was the only touchdown of the game, as the Giants would win it by a final score of 10-0. Without this wild play, the Giants might not win the game, and NFL history doesn't change forever as a result of it with the NFL Championship the following week. And yes, the play looked undoubtedly cool. A design lateral in the open field like that, where 4 people touched the ball, with the first and the 4th person to do it being the quarterback, who has to get all the way up the field in order to make this play work, and get into the second level like a lineman? Yeah, that's sick. But what's crazy is that this play actually worked, because that was, quite literally, the first time it ever had. As you're hearing this story about Lombardi, prepare yourself, because this goes against everything that you might think of when you think of Vince Lombardi. When offensive coordinator Vince Lombardi, who would go on and do incredible things with the Green Bay Packers the following year as their head coach, drew this play up, he called it the Brown Special. So this preceded the Philly Special by half a century, and both plays involved the same thing: the quarterback scoring a touchdown in a rather unconventional manner. Whether this was by design or by complete coincidence, I'm not sure. However, I'm leaning toward coincidence, seeing as nothing pops up when you search for Philly Special and Brown Special together. Lombardi saw something while watching the Browns play twice, including in their final regular season game, won by the Giants 13-10. He also knew that his men, who had just 64 yards rushing on under 3 yards a carry in that game, would need to establish the run to have a chance at winning. So this play ought to do the trick in his eyes. But when Lombardi introduced the play in practice on the Tuesday leading up to the game, the players thought it was a joke. They thought to themselves, is Lombardi serious right now? He wants us to do all of this? He thinks this play can work? But okay, maybe if the play works in practice, they'll be convinced. Except, it didn't. The play actually failed quite miserably in practice. On Friday, the Giants ran this play for the final time before their game, and they managed to fool themselves in the process. When the play was run in practice for the final time, the final lateral sailed 10 feet over the head of the quarterback. When the play was run in practice for the final time, the execution was all off, and it resulted in a turnover. In other words, the last time the play was run, it ended on the most sour note possible. And what's even crazier is that the man in question who scored the touchdown, Charlie Connerly, the man who was arguably the most important piece in this entire equation for the play to work, seeing as he had to snap the ball, know where to hand it off to, know where he had to be on the field in the second level to receive the final lateral, and know what to do once he had the ball in his hands, he had never run the play before in his life. The Eastern Conference playoff was the first time that Connerly ran that play. When the play was done in practice, it was being run by their backup quarterback, Don Heinrich. I find this especially hysterical because Vince Lombardi was a huge proponent of practice, arguably his most famous quote of all time, and a quote that still resonates all these years later is practice doesn't make perfect, perfect practice makes perfect. And yet, he seriously called a play in a playoff game that the quarterback in question had never practiced before, and called a play that was an unmitigated disaster in practice. The play even caught Connerly by surprise, as he called a timeout right before the play happened, just to make sure that Lombardi really wanted him to run this. He was second-guessing himself. And safe to say, it worked to perfection. Somehow, it worked to perfection, even though it never had before, and even though the man who ran it had never run it before himself. As Frank Gifford said on the play, you get a boot out of running a play like that. It's exciting to the crowd and to us too if it works. As for the man who called the play and drew this crazy thing up in the first place, Vince Lombardi, he said on the play, which Giants players later referred to as the thing, "We put this play in especially for this game, because we noticed that their defensive end, Bob Gain, was laying himself open for it." And Lombardi knew that if, and only if, the Giants executed this play to perfection, that the Browns would have no chance at stopping it, because Lombardi knew every single play that the Browns had ever run against them on defense. Lombardi had an entire folder in the days leading up to the game of charts showing every single defensive formation and alignment and play that the Browns called against the Giants in previous meetings. He knew that they would not see this play coming, and if it worked, it would completely turn the tide in favor of the Giants. And it absolutely did. This was a high-risk, high-reward play, and the reward absolutely won out here. A lot of people talk about the 1958 New York Giants as having the greatest coaching staff of all time, and it's not hard to see why. You had Jim Lee Howell as head coach, a man who probably should be in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. You had Tom Landry as a defensive coordinator, and you had Vince Lombardi as the offensive coordinator. I mean, that is a stacked coaching staff. And when you talk about how great that coaching staff is, the game between these two teams behind me right here is a perfect example of that. Because Vince Lombardi's strategy for this game to get past the Browns defense was nothing short of genius, even if it completely went against his philosophy on practice. I guess there's a first time for everything. Lombardi once said, "We win our games in practice. We learn and follow the fundamentals of our game better than anyone in the league. All of our games are won in practice." Well, that clearly didn't apply for this play that you've watched quite a few times now, where it was treated like a joke in practice when it was first introduced, where it failed miserably and the lateral sailed over the intended target's head by a country mile the last time it was run, and where the player who was the most instrumental part of this and was the ringleader on the play had never even run the play before. Because as it turned out, when it came to the 1958 Eastern Conference playoff, you didn't need perfect practice to make perfect. Sometimes, you didn't even need practice. Get your official Jaguar Gear 9 merchandise by going to jj9shop.com, and be sure to like and subscribe, as it really helps the channel out a lot. Join me every Wednesday night where we'll play NFL Trivia for cash prizes at 9 p.m. Eastern over on Twitch. To learn more about the history of college football, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 8. To learn more about the history of Major League Baseball, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 7. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. See how you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.